News Today I'm going to start the webinar. It's our webinar 121. It's called How to Loosen Up Enemy King's Pawn Cover. Okay, so we are waiting for more people to enter our webinar. However, those who already entered it, please let me know if the sound and video quality is good. Okay, so I see people joining. We'll wait for more people to enter our webinar. I believe the topic is quite interesting, especially for club players. Yeah, looks like everything is working. Okay. Oh, yeah, good morning, Michael. What can you say about the sound and video quality? Is that okay? I am also streaming this webinar on both platforms, YouTube and Twitch. Okay, so while we're waiting for more people to come, let me first explain what we are going to cover on the webinar. So today I prepared several games. I'm not sure if we can cover all of them, but we are going to talk about different pawn structures and how to deal with them. For example, this is the basic pawn structure that we have, and one of our main goals is to try to weaken the pawns. So we can do it with by attacking with our pieces, for example. If, for example, we have to face with such a pawn structure with the pawn on g6, a so-called fianchetted castling position, then we should take the advantage of the weaknesses of h6 and f6 squares, as well as to attack the pawn on g6, maybe with the h pawn, maybe with something else. Here, when the pawn is on h6, it's also the object of the attack, and you probably know a lot of opportunities. You can sacrifice the bishop to h6, you can pressure g7, because if they push g6, the pawn becomes weaker, and the h6 it becomes even a hanging pawn in this case. As for this pawn structure, which looks actually okay, I can say that the main weakness is this diagonal and the king is exposed. So in one of our games that we are going to cover today, I analyze such pawn structure and demonstrate how white should take the advantage of it. And of course, one of the typical ways to ruin the pawn structure is to capture the knight on f6 with the bishop to force them to take, and that exposes the king. However, it doesn't mean the game is winning. It just gives us more area to continue the attack. Okay, let's start. And we are going to start with this game, the game between Alexander Alekin and Imre Koenig. So I see more people joining. That's good. I also posted it on in a few clubs. Yeah. Let's start with the analysis. So, no, the opening doesn't matter, but it was a kind of a weird move order of Nimza Indian, of Queen's Indian to be precise. Queen c2, d5. d5 is quite a common move. C takes d5, knight takes there, but the problem is that now e4 can be played, and white gets the control over the center. Usually in Grunfeld, for example, when g6, bishop g7 is played instead of these two moves, they exchange on c3 and then undermine it with c5 pawn, and that makes sense. However, with the bishop being fianchetted on the queen side, this strategy with no pawns on d5, with no pawns in the center, doesn't make much sense. Knight f3, e6, e4, knight takes, pawn takes, and white has a strong pawn center. Bishop e7. And now the first sneaky move that white played. Actually, what would you do if you were white in this position? Develop white bishop to d3. Yeah, that's the most logical move. I agree with you. But before doing it, you'd better first play this nice check, because this check provokes them to play c6 with the pawn, what means that the bishop is now blocked. Of course, knight d7 means knight e5 with a strong pressure. Knight c6, still knight e5 with queen a4. Bishop c6 I think doesn't make much sense. You can also continue with bishop takes bishop, knight takes bishop, and queen a4, which is quite dangerous. So c6, bishop retreats to d3 because d3 is the best spot. Castle, and what do you think white should do in case if they are about to start the kingside attack? How would you play if it's your plan to attack on the king side? Yes, e5 exactly. With this move, you get more space on the king side and prevent their pieces activity. So if, for example, instead of e5 you castled, they could probably continue with c5, trying to open up the position. But e5 first. And the pawn is hanging, so that's why h6. Well, first of all, g6 is also a solid move, but it means that now white can initiate a strong attack with h4, h5, which is actually quite strong when the rook is still on the h file. For example, h4, c5, h5, and we are about to exchange and sacrifice the bishop. If queen e8, it's just bishop h6. The rook is trapped. If something like that, then of course sacrifice and capture. So g6 was a mistake, h6 was played in the game. Now, what do you think white should do? Should they somehow sacrifice on h6, or maybe use their g pawn, or maybe something else? How would you play if you were white? Okay, h4 and then g4, g5. Okay, a4. What's the logic of a4 move? So Anirudh also suggests h4 and g4. A4 with the idea to get rid of the bishops. Well, no, that makes sense. But at the same time, this bishop takes some space from black. They actually want to exchange pieces. H4, yeah, H4 was played. However, the idea of this move is not only to play G4, G5. G4, G5 maybe, but if you play this move, you are likely to lose the knight. For example, C4, C5, and now G4 cannot be played. The knight is hanging just. That's why in this position, white continued with rook h3. So it's a weird strategy to develop the rook from the edge, but in this exact case it works. The rook either goes here or there. Something like that is a blunder. No, well, just rook takes f3 and this pawn is not hanging because of bishop e4, of course. So rook h3, and this is where they played king h8. That was a weak move, after which white was able to succeed with their kingside attack. However, even here they could have a chance to be able to secure their position and end up in a slightly worse position. Yeah, knight g5 may be the idea, but maybe later. Because when you play knight g5, you should be sure that they take with the pawn. If they not, then what the knight does on g5. Okay, so they could save their position if only they played f5 to close the bishop. So we have to take. Rook g3 no longer makes sense. There is not enough attackers. They can just move the king there. So we have to take en passant. Let's say rook takes, bishop h7, king f8, bishop e4 to exchange the bishops. And in this position, they can just continue with queen d5, and queen h7 won't be a big problem. Yes, white is better, but at least black didn't lose the game. White attack is still strong. They can play this move, pressure there. They have always queen h8. So there will be some serious problems black would have to solve, but actually that was definitely much better than the move they played in the game, king h8. Because king h8 automatically faces with what move? What do you think? So what, guys, come to your mind? So I'm looking to your comments on all three, I mean on both platforms, Twitch and YouTube, and also in my Skype. G4. Well, G4, yeah, we will analyze this move, but that's not the right move. What I don't like about G4 is that they can just take on F3 and then capture on D4 for free. G4, G5, Knight G5. Well, Knight G5 right now doesn't make much sense. Well, they can capture with the bishop, then let's say if you take with the pawn, maybe something like that, you take there, but G6 and bishop G6 here isn't a good idea. They can take on G2 to save. What else? G4 right away, then C takes D4, and if C takes D4, they take on F3 and then take on D4. So bishop F4 doesn't make sense because the rook is hanging on A1. If here you capture with the knight, then just knight C6 and you lost your pawn chain, the position becomes open and there is no prospects for the kingside attack. Yes, so the right move here is bishop takes h6. So I love my bishop is correct. G takes h6 and queen d2. After that, there is nothing they can do to save the pawn. For example, in case of king g7, just rook g3, the king has to go back and it's a checkmate on h6. If bishop g5, you just take with your knight and then with your rook to force them to sacrifice the queen for that rook. Like that, and it's still a checkmate after that because of queen h6, queen h7. Okay, so this is what black realized after bishop h6 happened on the board and decided not to take the bishop but played f5. However, the game is over. They already pawned down against such a strong grandmaster as Alexander Alekhine was. So E takes f6, bishop takes f6, bishop g5. C takes d4. Well, here of course knight takes d4 can be played, but Alexander Alekhine played a better move. Can you please suggest it? Okay, no, h5 is too slow. Moreover, bishop g5 then. Yeah, so here Michael is correct. It's knight e5. Well, yeah, both. I love my bishop and Michael are correct. It's knight e5 because with knight e5 we're threatening with knight g6. And the bishop is pinned. So how to continue? For example, d takes c3. However, the main idea is not only to fork but to get the queen to h5. Nothing can stop the queen coming there. For example, queen e8, just bishop g6, and they have to give up the queen. So knight c6 was played in the game, queen e2 and g6 with the pawn, but it doesn't make much sense. King g7, and this is where the game can be won with a simple tactical strike. Can you please find the simple tactical strike? Okay, hi everyone, for those especially who joined the webinar recently. Yes, guys, you're right. So Tim was the first who suggested this move. It's bishop h6. Bishop h6, and after they take, it's queen h5, queen h7 mate. If they don't take, then knight c6 to simplify, and after queen e6 there is nothing to talk about. King comes there, but the game is lost. They just are down a rook in this position. So you know, every time you start the attack, you shouldn't always checkmate. Your task is either to checkmate or to end up with extra material and pass the game to absolutely winning endgame, like Alexander Alekin did. It's not the endgame, but it's absolutely winning position. So this is a completely winning. The king is in the center, but it cannot be checked. Queen e7 doesn't make much sense. D takes c3, well, just rook f3 to pin it is enough. And if king g7, just h5. If c2 is played, well, the 7th rank is weak, and then queen comes there. If queen e7, then just exchange the queens and play rook f7. So the game is over. So one important thing I want you, actually not the only one, but an important thing I want you to learn is that if you want to succeed with the kingside attack, you should have something on e5. Either the pawn that closes the position and gets rid of the knight on f6, or it can be the knight that comes to the center and allows you maybe to initiate the pawn march. And your main task is to weaken the enemy king's pawn cover and then take the advantage of it. Try to exchange these pawn cover with your pawns, or look for a tactical strike, for example a sacrifice that worked in our case. So your task is to provoke a weakness and then take the advantage of it. If instead of the attack you can do something on the other side of the board and gain the material or get some even small advantage, it should be fine as well. So don't be afraid to convert your kingside attack to some other different type of the advantage, like maybe a bishop pair or extra exchange. Yeah, h6 is called a hook. There is also a similar word in Russian language. Yes, this pawn move allows us to open the position faster. It's always better to have the pawns on h7, g7 and f7. h6 sometimes create a luft on h7, but usually is the object of the attack, which allows either to sacrifice or to exchange with g4, g5. Okay, the second game we are going to cover is the game between Artur Yusupov and John Vanderwill. c4, knight f6, knight c3, e6, e4. So it was a weird version of the opening. I didn't see this opening, but actually, I mean, I haven't seen it before. Can you imagine? So with the pawn on c6, yeah, I saw, but not with the pawn on e6. e5, knight e4, knight f3. Well, probably to take is a bad idea, because then the pawn on e5 is a weakness. So knight f3, knight c6, bishop e2, bishop e7, and exchanging on e4 means to lose the pawn on e5. So white has to stay with their pieces as where they are and wait until they take. So castle, castle, d4, but black continues with b6. Bishop e3. Finally, they decided to take. Otherwise, white takes and pushes the pawn to d5 to dominate in the center. And on the next move, d takes c4 was played to open up the position. Why this move was played? Well, if not this move, but bishop b7, let's say white could capture on d5, and after e takes d5, the bishop is blocked. For example, bishop b7, c takes d5, if pawn takes, it's the bishop is blocked, if queen takes, it's just maybe queen c2 with the idea of c4 d5 later. So that's why d takes c4, bishop takes c4, and knight a5. Oh, but the bishop just retreats. So here again the pawn is on e5. Bishop b7. And now I want you to come up with a plan. You have a strong pawn chain, however they are about to undermine it. But you, with the pawn on e5, you have some space on the king side. So what do you think? How to take the advantage of that space and how to provoke weaknesses into the enemy camp? Well, I'm sure most of you want to play queen h5 here. But queen h5, then pawn to g6, and what? You have to retreat? Knight d2, knight e4. Sounds like a good plan. Bishop h7 is too early. This sacrifice doesn't work. So if you sacrifice on h7, you cannot play knight g5. The bishop is here. So knight d2 was played. Actually, the original idea of this move was not to jump to e4 with your knight, but to release the queen. And actually not to h5. Oh, of course, c5, undermining, and queen g4, because after queen g4, you are threatening with this move. So they have to play g6. If, for example, you play queen h5, then after g6, queen g4, you lost the tempo. Here, it's your move to continue, and then you can continue with knight e4, for example, which was not the best move, but okay. So why they have to react with g6? Good question. What if, for example, they move the king? If so, you can just play this move, and they still have to play g6 anyway. So they lost the tempo with king h8, and then finally played g6, but you located your queen on h3, which is maybe better than on g4. What else can be done against queen to g4? For example, rook e8. Well, g6 to provoke them, and then let's take the advantage of these weak squares into the enemy camp. So rook e8 also is not doing much. So let me answer your question about bishop h7 and knight g5, bishop g5. Yes, you can play queen h5, but they just block on h6. Moreover, even if they don't but move the king away, you are one minor piece down. But of course they block, and then white loses. They have no forces to continue the attack. So knight d2, c5, queen g4, g6 was played, and knight e4 was played by Arthur Yusupov. So why this move? Well, I don't like it because I think black can just exchange, and without the white knight, it's almost impossible to take the advantage of the weakness of f6. I would continue with bishop e4 first, exchange the bishops, and then get my knight to e4. However, knight e4, and white was lucky. Black didn't capture the knight on e4 with their bishop. They played knight c6 back to pressure on d4, but the d4 pawn is not hanging. White played some prophylaxis, but if knight d4 now, it's just bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, and knight f6, a discovered attack. And now this queen captures on d4. So that's why knight b4 was played. What do you think? How to continue in this position? So with the pawn on g6, these two squares are weak, but how to take the advantage of them? Let's come up with a plan, guys. Right now, black wants to take our bishop. No, I think the bishop maybe is not the best piece, but is quite important for the position. Bishop b1 and then bishop to g5. Well, that makes sense, but it's too slow. You can play better. First of all, you can play this move. And knight d3 right now doesn't work, because then you capture on h6 and gain the exchange. After they take your bishop, you take the rook, or you take the knight with your rook. And there is no tempo move with that knight. Well, knight b2, for example, you can continue with bishop takes e7, then knight f6, and so on. So that's why after bishop h6, they have to move the rook. And now you gain another tempo. Bishop c6. Well, of course, knight c6 maybe is a better move, but how they can play knight c6 if they were just recently on b4? No, they were on c6, then to b4, then back to c6. Well, it's a... from the psychological point of view, it's not a good move to retreat. So they play bishop c6, but actually the knight on e4 is better than any other minor piece. That's why to secure the knight's position, we can just exchange the bishops and keep our knight there. Can you please guess the next move that white played here? Now bishop g5. Well, if there was no better move, I would say yes. Now bishop g5 looks like a logical plan, because you exchange the bishops and then jump to f6. And after knight comes to f6, of course, white is almost winning. h4, well... maybe, but not right now. Right now, no, well, I'm not afraid of bishop h4, because then knight d6 and the rook has to move to e7 to break the connection. And it breaks the connection between queen and bishop, and the bishop on h4 is hanging. A rook lift. Yeah, no, h4 actually makes sense. So, Michael, just to demonstrate that this move works, here you can continue with knight d6, and the rook is trapped. If it goes there, then this is hanging. d5, well, is a possible plan, but it's too early to play it right away. Now, h4, h5 is just so slow. Rook ab1 was played in the game. I'm sure nobody could guess this move. What's the logic? It's just a rook lift. This rook has to stay to protect on d4, but the other rook is useless, so white tries to activate it. Queen d5, queen f4, So the pawn on d4 is still not hanging. Knight takes, rook takes, queen takes, knight f6. And now white focuses on the other weakness, on f7, because there is no rook f8 move, and it's hard to support the pawn on f7. It's the object of the attack. So this is where they have to play this move back to protect maybe g5 and f6 squares. But what if they played this? Oh, well, I'm sure you say knight f6, and yes, I agree with you, because well, yes, knight f6 works, because after bishop f6, queen f6, and there is no defense, and they have to take, otherwise the queen is lost. So with after queen f4, we're threatening with this move, so they had to play queen d8 to secure this square. But rook b3, rook c8, and now h4, and if bishop h4, it's just knight to d6 fork. So h4 wasn't the best move, actually. Well, maybe it was one of the best move. But there was also a simple move that could offer an absolutely winning position. Can you please guess this move? Oh, well, not to guess, but you can definitely find it. Yes, exactly. It's rook to f3. Rook f3, and they have to play rook f8 and give up the exchange. h4, rook c7 to protect on f7. Rook f3 now, and that move was a mistake. Well, no, not a huge mistake, but maybe not the best option. Another way to continue was to play d5. E takes d5, rook takes d5, because if now queen takes d5, it's knight f6 with the same idea to checkmate on g7. Okay, guys, but you may ask me, well, and how to deal if they play queen e5? Because queen e5 secures g7, so how would you react if queen e5 is played? Yes, it's rook e3. Rook e3, and if queen takes queen, it's just a checkmate on e8. If not, then you gain the queen and then deliver a checkmate anyway. Okay, so rook f3 was okay move, d5 was faster, so rook f8, and in this position they decided not to take the they decided to take the exchange actually. Queen f8 and d5 now. E takes d5, rook takes d5, but the position is completely winning. They played a few more moves that don't make sense for our analysis. Well, finally, after this fork, black resigned. If not this fork, if they played something else, maybe let's say a5, I don't know, then a3, and with extra exchange, white can successfully realize their advantage. f7 is hanging, by the way. But what I want you to learn from this game. So first of all, white provoked black to play g6. With this queen move to g4, they forced black to play g6 and create weaknesses on these two squares. Then white realized that when the rook is out of the f8 square, it means that the pawn on f7 is now the other object of the attack, and to be able to attack it, they played a rook lift and doubled their queen and a rook on the f file, and finally we were able to either gain the pawn or gain the pawn and deliver a checkmate, or gain the material after rook f8. And then it's just a technical task. White wins because of extra material. To be able to do that, they should open up the position. So you try to provoke such moves like g6 and h6 to be able to create weaknesses into the enemy camp and then just take the advantage of it. So here g6, when the pawn is on e5, of course weakens the f6. Okay, the next game I would like to demonstrate is the game between Wolfgang Ullmann and Sergio Mariotti. In this game, there was another pawn structure. It seemed there was no weaknesses into black camp, but white was able to create these weaknesses. And no, this is what you definitely should learn, because well, if your opponent doesn't blunder, this is how you can win the game. c4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6. So it's English opening, and they played d5, c takes d5, knight d5, bishop g2, creating a discovered attack. That's why they decided to retreat to c7. Queen e4 was played. Oh, these moves all are theory. This is actually I can't say it's a famous position, but actually it was played quite often. And in this position they decided not to play bishop d7 because of queen e4 and some pressure on b7. They played queen d7 to keep the bishop on c8 to save the pawn. Castle, e5, occupying the center, a3. And in such positions, it's very common when black plays f6. This time it was an accuracy that later resulted in a mistake, and the main factor was this diagonal that black weakened. So, well, I can't say that f6 is generally a bad move. It's definitely part of black's plan, but they are not developed to be able to do that. In case if white opens the position, with the king in the center, they are likely to lose the game immediately. So, white continued with e3, and I'm sure you understand why. They are about to play d4, so the next move is rook d1, threatening with d4, and black played rook b8. To have in mind b5. d4, e takes d4, e takes d4, and b5 was played, finally. Queen retreats. And this is where black is in trouble, because d takes c5 is coming, there will be attack with the rook versus the queen. The bishop may pressure on c6, so they decided to take. How would you continue in this position? So what you suggest? Bishop e3 to pressure d4. Well, this move deserves attention. What else? With the idea of b4, knight e4. Well, knight e4, not so sure about this move. The knight is not hanging. Yeah, maybe the move is generally good. Bishop e3 is definitely the move I like, but knight comes to e6. And then you have to play this, and then you take. But, well, there is no so much advantage as it could be. First of all, I want you to understand that there is no reason to play with the knight right away. There is a pin here. They lose the queen. So knight d4, knight takes d4, they reinforce it, so it doesn't work. But you can take the advantage of the pin of the knight on c7 and continue with bishop f4. For example, in the game it was b4, and white immediately took on c7 to be able to activate the knight. Queen comes to d6. Knight takes d4, protecting here, threatening to take on c6, to take on f6 maybe, to create a discovered attack. So they have to take. Now rook takes. Finally, black was able to castle. But there is a problem. If the pawn was on f7, I would say they are okay. Maybe their position is not much worse, but because of the pawn on f6, it's worse. So white didn't play their best move. They just continued with rook a d1. However, I want you to find a better move that white could play to be able to win the game in just a few moves. After a few moves, it will be obvious that white is absolutely winning. So what do you think? What move I am talking about? Oh, wow. Oh, actually. Okay, I see. So the idea of bishop f4 was also suggested by lockdown. So what are your suggestions here? Queen b3 looks good. Well, queen b3, king h8. What else? Rook a1 is another suggestion. Okay, I'm waiting for more suggestions. What are your other moves candidates? Well, rook h4. Well, no, rook h4 just a 5 maybe, and the rook is hanging. Queen c6, queen takes c6, knight e7, king h8, knight takes c6, but where is your advantage? The maximum you have is one of these two pawns. Well, yeah, queen c6 looks good. No, it's not the best move, of course, but it looks very nice. However, what if they just play bishop b7? Yeah, it's not clear. So knight takes b4, and if queen d4, knight c6, well, but they just go back to d6. Okay, so the right move was suggested by I Love My Bishop. It was rook e1. Threatening to take. Now this is a check, and the queen is hanging. So which move, what moves I analyzed for black? King h8, just rook takes e7 and extra minor piece, so it's time to resign, especially for grandmasters. What else can be done? Rook f7 to support, but if rook f7, then knight takes e7, rook takes e7. Well, you can take on d6, of course. Or you can take on e7, queen takes e7, and here you can play a very nice move. What do you think? Which move I'm talking about? Just maybe the last move to be able to prove you're winning. Who knows? Okay. Looks like it's difficult to come up with... Queen d3 was suggested by Lockdown, but no. Queen d3, maybe just bishop e6 is enough. No, it's rook to b4, with the idea to distract and to gain a minor piece. Even queen e1, bishop f1 doesn't help black. Why? For example, if, let's say queen e1, bishop f1, bishop b7. You can first take, and then play queen c8, take the rook. If they somehow try to play bishop b7 right away, you can just take, rook takes, and then play queen b3 and take there. Or maybe, well, not queen b3, but queen c8. Queen c8 is better. Well, if this move, then you take there immediately. Yeah, looks like that's it. So rook b4 is a winning move. If speaking about bishop d8, well, knight e7 at least works, but yeah, knight e7 should work. Knight e7, take there, and then just continue with queen d3, maybe something like that. Yeah, this is a winning position. So I don't know why, but white didn't play this move. They played rook a d1, which is also a good move. Okay, bishop d8. Now, how to play now, and I'm sure that after the next move, black would have to resign anyway. Oh, let me, while you're thinking, let me quickly answer to Michael's move about queen e5 that defends the rook in this position. No, it doesn't, because of queen b3, and rook takes b8 on the next. Even if you play bishop e6, it's still rook takes b8. Okay, now let's go back to this position where I asked you to find the move for white. Knight takes b4. Well, knight takes b4 is a good move. I agree with you, but no, it's not the best one. Well, first it was played queen c4, which is not the best move, but it's almost the best move. Because if something like that, bishop e6, which seems to be natural, yeah, I see about queen d3 instead of rook e1. Yes, this move won't make much sense. Rook a d1 was better than queen d3 anyway. So bishop e6, knight b4 can be played. The queen is hanging, so queen takes queen, rook takes d6, and this is a winning position. Why? Well, knight c6 is coming, the bishop is hanging, and it's actually difficult to come up with a move. But bishop e6 maybe was the best move. Instead, they played king h8 as a prophylaxis. And after the next move of white, black resigned. What do you think this next move would be? No, could be. Okay, and here again, I love my bishop is correct. By the way, could you remind me what's your chess.com ELO is? Yes, it's knight f4 with knight g6 and rook h4. For example, queen e7, knight g6 check, they have to take, and rook h4 is a checkmate. So you see the diagonal was open, and white finally took the advantage of this weak diagonal. If queen e5, it's pretty much the same. Knight to g6, h takes g6, rook h4, queen h5, and then you just take it, and well, continue with queen c5, let's say, double attack. 2200, wow. It's a lot. Well, yes. So you see, when f6 is played, it means this diagonal is weak, and you can think about how to take the advantage of it. White allowed black to castle, but finally we were able to take the advantage of this diagonal because they had either queen b3 in all these variations. For example, which move did I... rook f7, knight e7, rook e7, rook. So they had either queen b3 to attack the rook, or the idea that they finally applied with queen c4 and knight f4, knight g6. This is how they took the advantage of this open diagonal. Here f6 wasn't provoked, and actually, in my opinion, black could play better, and instead of playing f6, just continue with something like bishop e7, then castle, and maybe later in the game after knight e6, only they can continue with f6. Okay. The other game I would like to demonstrate, let me... The other game I would like to demonstrate is the game between Tarash and Mezus. The position was equal, and white found a way of how to ruin the enemy king's pawn cover. Let's look at it. So it was French defense, but with a different move order. Knight c3, d takes e4. The name of this variation is Rubinstein variation. Knight takes, knight d7, knight f3, knight gf6, and usually it's better to take, but bishop d3 was played, and after bishop e7, castle, knight takes e4, and knight takes f6 is just the same position but with a different move order. b6, knight e5. No, this is a blunder, of course. Here, for example, bishop b7 doesn't work because of bishop b5. They castled first, and they had they allowed white to capture this bishop on e7. So queen d6. But before taking on e7, they first played queen f3 to be able to take the rook. Oh, bishop d7 to connect the rooks. Knight takes e7, queen takes e7. And what do we have? These two pieces are into the attack. There is some control of the e5 square, but no piece or a pawn standing there, so that's why the knight on f6 exists and still protects their position. So what do you think? How to create any weaknesses into the enemy camp to start the attack? Yeah, bishop g5 is a good start here. h4 maybe too early. Bishop g5, and if they play h6, they of course weaken their position. No, h6, bishop h4. So bishop g5, rook ac8, with the idea of c5 in future. So rook f e1, rook f e8, and queen h3, provoking them to play h6. If now h6 is played, how would you continue? Okay, so there is some question about the previous game, and I'm going to explain it a little bit later after we finish the analysis of this exact game. So h4 again. Oh, it was the last comment. Oh, so I mean, no, h4 cannot be played. The queen is already on h3. So what do you think? Should you do what? Yes, so bishop h4, then bishop c6, probably c4. Well, white is better, but not much. And they can start with a sacrifice. G takes h6, queen takes h6, with the idea to initiate a rook lift. Something like knight g4 won't work. Knight g4 just a checkmate in 2. So, while there is no defense, it's easy to white to just move the rook to g3 and that's it. So queen f8 is probably defense, but queen takes f6. No, there is nothing that black can do to stop it. So that's why h6 wasn't played. Instead they played queen d6 to unpin. The idea was to sacrifice the pawn on h7. So bishop f6, g takes f6, and if queen h7, king comes to f8, white is better, definitely. Let's say c3, c5, maybe d takes c5, rook takes c5, rook ad1, and their main idea was to move the king there, try to activate their pieces, and attack either the g or the h pawns to checkmate. Well, even if that happened, I believe white would still find how to defend their king's position and finally took the advantage of their extra material. But instead of playing queen h7, you can play better. So you suggest bishop takes h7 and then rook e4? Well, bishop takes h7, king comes to f8 and rook e4. Well, what's the point? You mean it's easier to defend through the g and the h files in case if they are going to attack your king? Maybe, but it doesn't offer so much advantage. Moreover, they can play maybe e5 and gain a tempo on the queen. Well, so it's not bishop h7. What else you can suggest? Bishop g5, f4. Instead, you can continue with queen h6. The move that was suggested by several people. So queen h6. With this move, you're threatening to checkmate, and you don't allow the king to go to f8. Bishop h7, king h8, bishop g6, king g8, queen h7, king to f8, and queen f7 is a mate. So, yeah, let me show you. Like that. So to prevent it, they should play f5. But rook e3, and now f4 doesn't work. This is where they have to resign. Well, they can play queen d4, but it's just a temporary defense. For example, oh, wait a sec. After rook queen d4, how to continue? Because if rook g3, just king h8. What can you suggest instead? Come on, guys, who knows the answer? c3, yes. So somebody joined our webinar and found it. c3, the queen has to move out from this diagonal. If it goes to g7, you just pin it. Same thing happens in case of queen h8, just rook g3 and you win the game. And well, yeah, after the queen retreats, rook g3, queen g7 is a checkmate. So c3, that was a winning move. So here I want you to learn this idea with bishop g5. So you pressure on f6, and at a certain moment of the game you take. In this game, no, to double the pawns. In this game, white combined these two ideas of taking on f6 and attacking on h7. What finally resulted into at least one extra pawn for white and a winning position. But instead of taking this pawn, they decided to take the advantage of the enemy king weakness with such move like queen to h6 and a rook leave after that. So keep in mind this idea for your future games. I'm sure you can implement it. Okay, let me cover the question that here. So if instead of bishop d6 they play bishop a6, well, if so, it's a checkmate in 3 moves. Who can find a checkmate in 3 moves? Yes, Tim is correct. It's knight e7, double check, king goes there, knight g6, h takes g6, and rook h4, checkmate. Yeah, exactly. Okay, guys, so that was all I wanted to show you today. So I kindly recommend you to send a friend request to me on chess.com. So this is my username. This is how you are unlikely to miss our next webinar that will be next Sunday, same time. Also the link to my blog, to my own website, that you also might be interested in. There are some helpful articles that help you to improve. If you have Instagram, you can also find me there. So my username there is tricks of chess with dots. And if you have any, if you're interested in any training programs or private chess classes, you can always message me at tricksofchess@gmail.com. So some of my current students attend the webinars as well. And what else? Please also subscribe to my YouTube channel. Let me share the link. This is the link of how to subscribe. Webinars are free, but private chess coaching is of course not. I charge money for that, and this is what I do for a living. Okay guys, thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, you can also email me. I always answer to everyone, and try not to miss next webinar, which will be same time, which is 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or it's for example 3 p.m. London time or 5 p.m. Moscow time. It depends on your time zone, but I think most people are from the United States. Perfect, and see you next Sunday.